The unexpected encounter. It was a typical sunny afternoon in Los Angeles, where the streets buzzed with the vibrant energy of city life. The sound of honking cars and distant laughter filled the air. Among the throng of vehicles was a sleek black SUV, its tinted windows reflecting the sunlight. Inside, none other than Big Shaq, the British rapper and comedian known for his viral hit, Man's Not Hot, was cruising down Sunset Boulevard. He had just wrapped up a filming session for his latest project and was looking forward to a relaxing day. As he drove, Big Shaq couldn't help but smile at the memories of his recent success. His music had taken off in ways he had never imagined, and he was now a household name. But today wasn't just about fame, it was about enjoying life and soaking in the city's atmosphere. Suddenly, flashing red and blue lights pierced through the afternoon haze. Big Shaq glanced in his rearview mirror to see a police car tailing him closely. Confused, he pulled over to the side of the road, wondering what could have prompted this stop. He had been driving within the speed limit and hadn't done anything out of the ordinary. The officer emerged from the vehicle, a stern look on his face. As he approached, Big Shaq noticed something unsettling about the officer's demeanor, a hint of hostility that seemed unwarranted. The cop was tall, with a rigid posture, and an expression that suggested he was ready for confrontation rather than conversation. "License and registration," the officer barked, cutting straight to business without any pleasantries. Big Shaq complied, reaching into his glove compartment to retrieve his documents. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked casually, trying to diffuse what felt like an escalating situation. The officer's eyes narrowed as he examined Big Shaq's ID. "You know why I stopped you?" he replied curtly, ignoring Big Shaq's question. "No, I don't," Big Shaq responded, maintaining his calm demeanor. "I was just driving." The officer leaned in closer, his tone dripping with suspicion. "You fit a description of someone we're looking for," he said flatly. Big Shaq raised an eyebrow, taken aback by the accusation. "A description? Of who? I'm just a guy trying to enjoy my day." The tension in the air thickened as the officer continued to scrutinize him. It became clear that this wasn't just a routine traffic stop, it felt personal. Big Shaq could sense that the officer had already made up his mind about him based solely on appearances. "Step out of the vehicle," the officer ordered abruptly. Big Shaq hesitated for a moment, but complied, stepping out onto the asphalt with a mix of confusion and frustration. He knew that as a public figure, this kind of interaction could escalate quickly, especially given the current climate surrounding police interactions with people of color. As he stood beside his SUV, Big Shaq noticed other drivers slowing down to gawk at what was happening. Some took out their phones to record, while others watched with concern etched on their faces. The scene felt surreal. Here he was, a well-known entertainer being treated like a criminal for no apparent reason. "Where are you coming from?" the officer demanded, still not letting up on his aggressive stance. "I just finished filming," Big Shaq replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm not doing anything wrong." The officer scoffed at this response and began radioing for backup without warning. "I need additional units at my location," he said into his radio, his voice cold and unyielding. Big Shaq's heart raced as he processed what was happening. Why would this officer call for backup? Was it because of who he was, or simply because of an unfounded assumption? The crowd that had gathered began to murmur among themselves, sensing that something wasn't right. In that moment, Big Shaq decided he wouldn't let fear dictate how this encounter would unfold. He pulled out his phone discreetly and began recording, documenting what could potentially become another troubling story about racial profiling in America. As more police cars arrived on the scene, sirens blaring in the distance, Big Shaq realized that this situation was spiraling out of control fast, and it wasn't just about him anymore, it was about standing up against injustice. The tension escalates. As the first police car pulled up behind the officer's vehicle, Big Shaq felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The arrival of backup transformed the situation from an uncomfortable traffic stop into a full-blown spectacle. He could see the curious faces of bystanders, their phones raised high to capture every moment, and it struck him that this was no longer just about him. It was about something much larger. The initial officer, still standing with his arms crossed, seemed to take on a more authoritative air as his colleagues arrived. 2 additional officers exited their cars, scanning the scene with expressions that ranged from indifference to outright suspicion. Big Shaq couldn't help but notice how their eyes flicked toward him, assessing him as if he were a potential threat, rather than an innocent driver caught in an unfortunate situation. "Sir, can you explain why you're recording?" one of the new officers asked, stepping closer with a slightly aggressive posture. Big Shaq held his ground. "I'm documenting this interaction," he replied firmly. "I have every right to do so." The officer narrowed his eyes. "You're being detained for further questioning. We need to ensure there's no misunderstanding here." "Detained?" Big Shaq echoed incredulously. "For what? You still haven't told me what I did wrong." The first officer interjected, his voice dripping with condescension. "We received reports of suspicious activity in this area. You fit the description of someone we're looking for." Big Shaq felt a wave of frustration wash over him. "What description? I'm just a guy driving home after work." He gestured toward the crowd gathering around them, feeling both exposed and empowered by their presence. "Stay calm," the second officer said, attempting to defuse the situation, but failing miserably. "We're just doing our job." "Your job?" Big Shaq replied, incredulous. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to harass people based on how they look." The tension in the air was palpable as bystanders began to murmur louder, some expressing their discontent with what they were witnessing. A few individuals called out supportive comments toward Big Shaq, urging him to stand his ground. "Don't let them intimidate you," shouted a woman from the crowd. "Yeah, this isn't right," another voice chimed in. Big Shaq could feel the energy shifting. He wasn't just a celebrity anymore. He was a symbol of resistance against an unjust system. He took a deep breath and focused on maintaining his composure despite the mounting pressure. The first officer continued to bark orders at him, demanding that he step back from his vehicle and keep his hands visible at all times. Big Shaq complied, but couldn't shake off the feeling of humiliation that washed over him. He was being treated like a criminal for simply existing in his own skin. As more officers arrived on scene, Big Shaq noticed one officer who seemed different from the others, a woman who appeared younger and more empathetic. She observed quietly from a distance, while her colleagues continued their aggressive posturing. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" she finally asked one of her fellow officers, stepping aside to have a hushed conversation. Big Shaq watched intently as she gestured toward him, her expression serious yet compassionate. After a brief exchange, she approached Big Shaq with a calmer demeanor. "I understand this is frustrating," she said softly, "but we need to follow protocol." "Protocol?" Big Shaq replied sharply. "What protocol justifies treating me like this? I'm not a criminal." "I know," she said gently, "but we have to check things out before we can let you go." As she spoke, Big Shaq noticed that her tone was different, less confrontational, and more understanding than that of her colleagues. It gave him a glimmer of hope that perhaps not all officers shared the same mindset. Meanwhile, the crowd had grown larger, and people were now openly recording everything happening on their phones. Comments flew back and forth among them. Some were supportive, while others expressed disbelief at how the situation had escalated so quickly. "Look at this! This is ridiculous!" shouted one man as he filmed with fervor. "Why are they treating him like this?" another woman questioned angrily. Big Shaq felt empowered by their support, but also anxious about how far this would go. Would it end peacefully, or would it escalate into something more dangerous? Just then, one of the backup officers approached Big Shaq's SUV and began rifling through his belongings without asking for permission. Anger surged within him as he watched this blatant disregard for personal space and privacy unfold before his eyes. "Hey, what are you doing?" Big Shaq yelled, stepping forward instinctively. The officer turned sharply, irritation flashing across his face. "Just checking for weapons or anything illegal," he snapped back. "No one gave you permission to search my car." Big Shaq shot back defiantly. The atmosphere grew tense again as other officers turned their attention toward him once more. The woman who had spoken earlier stepped in between them, trying to mediate, but clearly struggling against her colleagues' aggressive tactics. "We need to de-escalate this," she urged them firmly, but calmly. Big Shaq took another deep breath, trying to remain composed, despite the chaos surrounding him. He knew he had to stay calm if he wanted to navigate this situation without it spiraling further out of control. "Look," he said slowly, addressing all the officers present, "I'm willing to cooperate if you treat me with respect." The first officer scoffed at this suggestion, but didn't respond immediately as tensions remained high in the air around them. As they continued to stand there under the glaring sun, Big Shaq, feeling vulnerable yet resolute. The call for backup. The sun hung high in the sky, casting long shadows on the asphalt as Big Shaq stood beside his SUV, surrounded by a growing crowd of onlookers. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and he could feel the weight of their gazes upon him. As the officers continued to scrutinize him, he knew that this moment was pivotal, not just for him, but for everyone watching. "Let's just get this over with," Big Shaq said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the rising anxiety in his chest. "I'm not a criminal, I'm just a guy who wants to go home." The first officer, still standing with arms crossed, shot him a dismissive glance. "You fit a description of someone involved in recent criminal activity," he reiterated, as if repeating the line would somehow make it more valid. "What description?" Big Shaq pressed, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. "You haven't given me any details. How can you justify treating me like this?" The officer opened his mouth to respond, but was interrupted by a shout from the crowd. "This is ridiculous! Let him go!" A man stepped forward, his phone recording the entire exchange. His voice carried a mix of anger and disbelief that resonated with many in the crowd. Big Shaq felt a surge of solidarity from the onlookers. Their support gave him strength to stand firm against the unjust treatment he was facing. But as he glanced back at the officers, he noticed that they were becoming increasingly agitated by the crowd's presence. "Back up! Everyone back up!" one of the newly arrived officers barked, brandishing his flashlight like a weapon. The crowd hesitated but remained rooted in place, unwilling to turn away from what they perceived as an injustice unfolding before them. "Hey, we're just watching!" shouted a woman from the back. "You can't treat him like this!" Big Shaq felt a mix of gratitude and concern for those standing up for him. He understood that their presence could either help de-escalate the situation or provoke further aggression from the officers. In that moment of chaos, Big Shaq noticed the younger female officer, the one who had shown empathy earlier, stepping forward again. She raised her hands in a calming gesture, trying to diffuse the tension. "Everyone, please," she called out. "We're trying to do our job here. We need space to assess the situation." Big Shaq seized this opportunity to address her directly. "Can you please explain what's going on? Why am I being treated like this? I haven't done anything wrong." She met his gaze and nodded slowly. "I understand your frustration," she said softly. "But we have to follow protocol when there's a report of suspicious activity." "Suspicious activity?" Big Shaq echoed incredulously. What did I do? Drive too nice of a car? The officer hesitated, clearly torn between her duty and her sense of justice. I can't disclose specifics, she replied carefully, but I assure you that we're not here to harm you. Just then, another officer interjected with impatience. Enough talking. We need to check his vehicle thoroughly. He gestured toward Big Shaq's SUV as if it were a potential bomb about to explode. Wait! You don't have probable cause! Big Shaq protested vehemently. You can't just search my car without reason! The first officer stepped forward again, his expression hardening. If you don't comply, we will have no choice but to detain you further. Big Shaq felt his heart race at those words. He knew that being detained could lead to serious complications, especially given his public persona and the scrutiny surrounding police interactions with celebrities and people of color. As tensions mounted, Big Shaq made a split-second decision. He would not let fear dictate his actions any longer. He turned back toward the crowd and raised his voice above the din. Listen up, everyone, he called out passionately. This isn't just about me, it's about all of us. We deserve respect and dignity no matter who we are or how we look. The crowd erupted into cheers and supportive chants, voices rising in unison against what they perceived as injustice. The officers exchanged glances, visibly shaken by the unexpected show of solidarity from the community. Feeling emboldened by their support, Big Shaq continued speaking directly to them. We need to stand together against this kind of treatment. No one should be judged based on their appearance or subjected to harassment without cause. For a moment, it seemed as if time stood still. Even the officers appeared taken aback by his words. But then reality crashed back in as one officer reached for his radio again. I'm calling for additional backup, he announced tersely into his device. Big Shaq's stomach dropped at that declaration. He understood all too well what calling for backup could mean in this context. More officers arriving could escalate tensions further and potentially lead to violence. Please don't do that, Big Shaq pleaded desperately, turning back toward the younger female officer who had shown some understanding earlier. We don't need more officers here, we need dialogue. But before she could respond, another squad car pulled up nearby with its sirens blaring, a stark reminder that this situation was spiraling out of control quickly. As more officers emerged from their vehicles, Big Shaq felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over him. The scene was becoming chaotic. Voices clashed in confusion while cameras continued rolling from every angle. Everyone needs to disperse, one of the new officers shouted at the crowd, while others began forming a barrier around Big Shaq's SUV. What are you doing? Someone yelled back from within the crowd. He hasn't done anything wrong. Big Shaq's heart raced as he realized that he was now at risk not only for himself, but also for those standing up for justice around him. He needed to find a way out, both for himself and for those who had rallied behind him. In that moment of desperation and chaos, Big Shaq took another deep breath and focused on what mattered most, staying calm amidst uncertainty while fighting against injustice, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever faced similar treatment at the hands of authority. Community voices. As the sirens faded into the background, replaced by an uneasy silence, Big Shaq stood at the center of a growing storm. The crowd around him had transformed from passive onlookers to active participants in a movement, united by a shared sense of injustice. He could feel their energy, an electric pulse of solidarity that surged through the air, pushing against the oppressive atmosphere created by the police presence. Everyone, stay calm, Big Shaq called out, raising his voice to cut through the rising tension. We're here to stand up for what's right. The crowd responded with cheers and shouts of agreement. We've got your back, Big Shaq, someone yelled, and the chant spread like wildfire. Let him go! Let him go! The officers, now outnumbered by the voices of dissent, exchanged glances, filled with uncertainty. The younger female officer who had tried to mediate earlier stepped forward again, her expression conflicted as she assessed the situation. She seemed to recognize that this was no longer just a routine traffic stop. It had become a public spectacle, a confrontation between authority and community. "Listen," she said, raising her hands in an attempt to calm both Big Shaq and the crowd. "We're not here to escalate things. We just need to ensure everyone's safety." Big Shaq seized this moment of potential dialogue. "Safety? You think I feel safe right now?" he shot back, gesturing toward the officers who had surrounded him. "You're treating me like a criminal without any reason. How is that safe?" The crowd erupted in agreement, their voices rising in unison once more. "Justice! Justice!" they chanted, their collective frustration echoing through the streets. The first officer, visibly frustrated by the turn of events, barked an order at his colleagues. "Get control of this crowd. We need to clear this area." But instead of dispersing, the crowd grew bolder. People began stepping forward one by one to share their own stories of mistreatment at the hands of law enforcement. Individuals who had faced similar situations based solely on their appearance or background. "I was stopped for no reason last week," shouted a young man with a determined look in his eyes. "They searched my car and found nothing. This has to stop." Another woman chimed in, her voice trembling with emotion. "My brother was arrested just for walking home from work. This isn't just about you, it's about all of us." Big Shaq felt a swell of pride as he listened to their stories. Real people sharing real experiences that resonated deeply within him. He realized that this moment had transcended his own plight. It was now a platform for others to voice their frustrations and demand change. "Thank you for sharing your stories," Big Shaq called out to the crowd. "This is what we need. We need to stand together and show that we won't be silenced anymore." As he spoke, he noticed that some officers were beginning to look uncomfortable. They shifted on their feet and exchanged glances as if unsure how to respond to this unexpected uprising. The younger female officer took a step closer to Big Shaq, her eyes filled with empathy. "I want to help," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the chants. "But I need you all to cooperate so we can resolve this peacefully." Big Shaq nodded slowly, recognizing her sincerity amidst the chaos. "I appreciate that," he replied, his tone softening slightly. "But we need accountability here. You can't just sweep this under the rug." Just then, another squad car arrived on scene, a stark reminder that tensions were still high and that more officers could mean more trouble. The sight sent ripples of anxiety through the crowd as they braced themselves for what might come next. "Everyone stay strong," Big Shaq shouted as he turned back toward his supporters. "We're not going anywhere. We deserve answers." As more officers poured out of their vehicles, Big Shaq noticed one man stepping forward, a tall officer with a calm demeanor who appeared to be in charge. He surveyed the scene before addressing both his colleagues and the crowd. "All right, everyone," he said, in a steady voice that commanded attention. "I understand there are concerns here, but we need to maintain order." Big Shaq felt a flicker of hope at this officer's approach. Perhaps there was still room for dialogue amidst all this chaos. "Sir," Big Shaq called out, stepping forward slightly but keeping his hands visible as a sign of compliance. "I'm willing to talk if you are, but we need transparency, no more hiding behind badges." The officer nodded thoughtfully but remained cautious as he approached Big Shaq and the younger female officer who had been trying to mediate throughout this ordeal. "I understand your frustration," he began carefully, "but we have protocols we must follow when responding to reports like these." "Protocols?" Big Shaq interjected sharply. "What about basic human decency? What about treating people with respect?" The officer paused for a moment before responding. "You're right. Respect is essential in these situations." He looked around at both his colleagues and the crowd before continuing cautiously. Let's take a step back and assess what's happening here. As he spoke, Big Shaq could see some officers visibly relaxing, while others remained tense, caught between their duty and the reality unfolding before them. "We're not looking for confrontation," he continued slowly but firmly. "We want everyone involved to feel safe and heard." The atmosphere shifted slightly as murmurs rippled through both the crowd and among the officers present. It seemed that perhaps there was room for compromise after all. "Let's work together," Big Shaq suggested earnestly. "We can find common ground if you're willing to listen." The younger female officer nodded vigorously beside him while others exchanged uncertain glances, some appearing more receptive than others. As conversations began taking place among both sides, officers discussing amongst themselves while community members shared their experiences, the tension slowly began dissipating into something resembling cooperation rather than confrontation. Big Shaq felt a sense of relief wash over him. Perhaps they would reach an understanding after all. A path forward. As the conversations unfolded, Big Shaq felt a cautious optimism begin to take root amidst the chaos. The atmosphere had shifted from one of confrontation to dialogue, and he could sense that both the officers and the crowd were beginning to find common ground. It was a small but significant victory in a landscape often marred by misunderstandings and conflict. "Let's take a moment to breathe," Big Shaq suggested, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "We're all here because we care about our community. Let's focus on that." The crowd quieted down, their chants fading into murmurs as they processed his words. Big Shaq turned to face the officer who had taken charge, hoping for a productive conversation. "Sir," he said, his voice steady but respectful, "I appreciate your willingness to engage with us, but I need to know how we can move forward from this situation. What steps can we take to ensure this doesn't happen again?" The officer nodded thoughtfully, clearly weighing his response. "First, let me apologize for the way this situation has escalated. It's never our intention to make anyone feel unsafe or disrespected." Big Shaq felt a flicker of hope at the officer's acknowledgement. "Thank you for saying that," he replied earnestly. "It's crucial for us to feel heard and understood." "Moving forward," the officer continued, "we can arrange community meetings where residents can voice their concerns directly to us. We want to build trust and ensure that everyone feels safe in our neighborhoods." The crowd reacted positively, murmurs of agreement rippling through them. Big Shaq seized this moment to reinforce the importance of collaboration. "That's a great start," he said, nodding in approval. "But we also need accountability. Training for officers on racial profiling and community engagement would be essential. It's not just about laws, it's about changing mindsets." The younger female officer stepped forward again, her eyes bright with determination. "I completely agree," she added passionately. "We need to address these issues head-on and work together with the community to create real change." As discussions continued, Big Shaq felt encouraged by the shift in tone among both officers and community members. It was clear that many shared his vision for a more equitable future, one where respect and understanding prevailed over fear and suspicion. "Let's also consider establishing a community advisory board," Big Shaq suggested, looking around at both sides. This board could include residents from different backgrounds who can provide ongoing feedback on police practices and community needs. The officer in charge nodded thoughtfully, clearly considering the implications of such an initiative. "That could be very beneficial," he replied slowly. "We need to ensure that our actions reflect the values of the communities we serve." As conversations flowed freely now, ideas exchanged between officers and residents, the initial tension began to dissipate entirely. People were laughing, sharing stories, and even shaking hands as they found common ground. Big Shaq took a moment to step back and observe the scene unfolding before him. a diverse group of individuals coming together, united by their desire for change. The energy was palpable. It felt like they were on the cusp of something transformative. Suddenly a voice broke through the chatter. A young girl at the front of the crowd raised her hand shyly. "Can I ask something?" she said hesitantly. "Of course," Big Shaq encouraged her warmly. "What if we have questions or concerns later? How do we know you'll listen?" she asked earnestly. Big Shaq smiled at her bravery. Her question encapsulated what so many were feeling. "That's an important point," he replied thoughtfully. "We need open lines of communication, maybe even a hotline or an online platform where people can share their experiences or concerns without fear." The officer nodded in agreement. "We can definitely look into creating those resources," he said earnestly. "It's vital that everyone feels empowered to speak up." As discussions continued, Big Shaq felt a sense of purpose wash over him, a realization that this moment was not just about him, but about creating lasting change within their community. After what felt like hours of dialogue, it was finally time for Big Shaq to address everyone one last time before parting ways. "Thank you all for standing up today," he began, his voice resonating with sincerity. "What we've done here is more than just resolve a situation. We've started a conversation that can lead us toward real change." The crowd erupted into applause, cheers filling the air, as people expressed their support for one another and their commitment to moving forward together. "I want each of you to remember this moment," Big Shaq continued passionately. "Change doesn't happen overnight. It takes effort from all of us, officers and community members alike, to build trust and understanding." As he spoke, he noticed some officers nodding along with him, acknowledging not only their role in this process, but also their willingness to learn from past mistakes. "Let's keep this momentum going," Big Shaq urged them all enthusiastically. "Let's make sure our voices are heard, not just today, but every day." With that final rallying cry, he stepped back as applause echoed around him, a powerful reminder that together they could forge a new path forward. As officers began dispersing back toward their vehicles with newfound purpose, some even stopping to chat with members of the crowd, Big Shaq felt an overwhelming sense of pride swell within him. He had faced adversity head-on, but emerged not only unscathed, but empowered alongside those who had rallied behind him, a testament to resilience against injustice. In that moment, under the warm California sun, the sound of laughter mingling with conversations filled with hope, Big Shaq knew they had taken an important step toward healing wounds that ran deep within their community. And as he drove away from that chaotic intersection, transformed into something beautiful, he couldn't help but smile at what they had accomplished together, a promise for change forged through unity amidst adversity.